Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Beacon in the Storm. I'm your host, Dr. Bradford Carlton. Today I have a very special guest with us. I have Dr. Rob Whitley, who's an associate professor at the Department of Psychiatry, at McGill University, and is a researcher at the Douglas Research Center. Additionally, he's the author of the book Men's Issues and Men's Mental Health. Hi there, Dr. Whitley. How are you doing today?
Hello, Bradford. I'm really thrilled to be on your program. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to begin. People don't seem to want to talk about men's issues. So I want to just, before we begin anything and kind of diving into any of the statistics, why did you decide to get into this?
Well, if you look at the statistics, men have a lot of issues. It sounds trite, but it's true. And a lot of them are very, very serious issues. So if we look, for example, at suicide, men account for about 75 to 80% of suicides in Western countries such as the UK, the US, Canada, Australia. If we look at substance use issues, the opioid crisis, opioid overdoses, people who are drinking heavily, taking a lot of illegal substances, again, that's predominantly men, 70 or 80%. And in terms of the overdoses from opioids and even from alcohol, we're talking about 70 to 80% men. If we go outside of the realm of psychiatry, which is my specialty, for example, in education, we know that men are accounting for the fewer and fewer high school graduates. Most high school dropouts are boys. In many universities now, the gender ratio is 60% women, 40% men. If you look at what is known in the UK and some other countries as NEETs, so NEETs is an acronym which is not in everyday jargon in the US or Canada, but it's a good acronym. It stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training, NEETS, the NEETs. It's an umbrella term for those kind of people who are really often living lives of despair, unemployed, hopeless. And men make up the vast majority of NEETs as well, young men in particular. So the statistics speak for themselves, and there was not many people in the academic area, especially in psychiatry, doing a focus on men and men's mental health. So I decided I would try and be a pioneer and get involved in this field, and lo and behold, here I am.
And you've become a world-renowned sensation because of it, right?
That's a very generous. Nobody's ever said that about me before, but I'm trying to make a little bit of a mark in the universe.
Okay. Hopefully you appreciate the humor. If not, I'd be happy to cut that. But
I'm flattered.
it's like before we started, I mentioned, it's fascinating because I've only been in this for two months. I didn't know that men had all these issues. It was, when you hear about men's issues, you hear that they're criminals, that they're the abusers, you hear all the negative things. But then when you actually look at the data, it's, well, men are actually the victims of most of things going on, and most mental health issues. I don't want to say most mental health issues, but most diseases affect men more than women. And so if we can, I'd like to dig into your book a little bit because your book is fascinating. And you start the book talking about suicide, which is the exact topic that got me into this. So you talk about the social determinants of male suicide. Maybe you can speak to those a little bit, please.
Yeah, so it's important to say that suicide is almost never can never be attributed to one single factor. So we have a web of causation. Suicide of an individual and of groups is typically multifactorial, and it's erroneous and even stigmatizing to say so and so killed themselves because of factor X or factor Y. In psychiatry, we have this thing called the biopsychosocial model, and this model, which is supported by a huge corpus of evidence, is that mental health outcomes such as suicide are a combination of very complex biological, psychological, and social processes. And there's some great research happening at my hospital here about the biological genetic antecedents of suicide. But what we do know is that people who have certain social factors, who have been exposed to certain social factors, are at a higher risk of suicide, and that's where I focus my energy. And some of the factors I'll talk about, two of the big ones are employment issues and divorce, marital issues, separation, etc. So we do know, for example, that men who are single and men who are divorced and men who are separated have higher suicide rates than men who are married. We do also know that men who are unemployed or who have never been employed have higher suicide rates than people who are employed. We also know that people who are employed in secure jobs where they have a high degree of control over their job have lower suicide rates than people who are in insecure work who have low degrees of control. So I think I'll throw that out there, and I don't know, happy to go into more detail about both of those factors or other factors. Not sure where you'd like to go, Bradford.
So really, I like you threw out kind of a bunch of different issues there, and it's, and you say there's no one thing. So how can we possibly help men? Like if we can't just get them jobs and that'll fix it, if we can't just fix their relationships and that, like, do we just have to, every single man, go to them and like make their life happy and wonderful? Is that the only way to stop suicide?
Well, there's a couple of overarching factors which affect employment, for example, which are more implicated in employment, implicated in factors such as divorce, marital status, and implicated in some of the other risk factors for suicide, such as kind of mental illness. And this is one of the overarching factors is what I call social integration. So when you are socially integrated, you basically have a much lower risk of suicide than when you are alienated and disenfranchised from society. And where do most of us get our social integration from? For many people in North America in particular, it is the workplace. And if you have a job and it gives you meaning and purpose, it gives you income, you get to see your colleagues, you feel like you're doing something useful with your life. For many people, it is in the family. If you're married, you have children, you're supporting a household, you're building up a house for yourself and for the future, that gives a lot of meaning and purpose. So we know that people who are unemployed, who are lonely, who are isolated, who don't have family, we know even people with pets, for example, that have a lower risk of mental health issues than people who don't have pets. So social integration is one of the key factors. And we could even delve deeper and talk about factors like meaning and purpose. Another group of people who have high risk of suicide are atheists, for example. And we could go down that rabbit hole, but one of the theories is that people who are religious, they go to a place of worship, or they go to a synagogue or church, they see their fellow congregants once a week. There's people picking up the phone and asking them how they are, if they are sick, or if they're not seen in church for a few weeks. So if we want to protect men from suicide, I feel we should always be thinking about social integration, meaning, purpose, and trying to understand where a man is at and trying to get him on a journey where he can gain those three factors.
Okay, so why is it that this affects men more than it does women? Like, I'm not quite sure, because women, I would seem, would have potentially the same issues with the social integration, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and many people in psychiatry have talked about this issue. I mean, if we zero in on a factor like employment, for example, we do know that in the typical household, we sometimes talk about the 1.5 income household. What that means is in a typical household, even though the woman is working, the man's work and the man's salary is of a much higher proportion typically. It is necessary for the mortgage, it is necessary to pay the bills, it is necessary to put the kids into school and to pay for their clothes and food.
Okay.
And women are more statistically more likely to work part-time, for example, or to work in a job that maybe gives them more satisfaction but less money. Men are more likely to work longer hours. They're more likely to work in dangerous and dirty occupations like in oil and gas and military, in the police, in security, in transport, manufacturing. These are places where there's industrial accidents that men might be exposed to. They might either see them or they might be injured themselves, which can be a factor in PTSD. So in the workplace, which I always think is a great example to look at this question, we know that if a man loses his job, for example, that could have very severe repercussions for the family. Whereas if a woman who in a typical household where it's a 1.5 earner family, if she loses her job, then the financial hit will certainly be tough, but it might not be to the same magnitude as if a man loses his job.
Okay, so I'm sitting here thinking that, is this a gender equality issue? Is it that men are societally expected to? Is this a psychological, just kind of how things are? Like, why is this the case?
Yeah, well, I think men are attracted to certain types of jobs. Men are, if you look, for example, people who do research on sex hormones and risk, that sex hormones, which are tend to be more common in men, are associated with risk. So men are attracted to jobs such as the military, the police, security, manufacturing, etc. And these jobs do involve very long hours. They do involve exposure to risk. They do involve relocation and in service abroad, for example, in the military. And I think that's just how it is. And I think the factor is not necessarily we could kind of navel gaze about is this gender equality or what are the real issues, but I think we need to look at solutions.
Okay.
What can be done to help men in this situation? And I certainly think it doesn't help, which I talk about in my book, this kind of tone of constant criticism of men and of looking at men, who, especially those who work in these fields where men are making, and the women who work in these fields are making huge sacrifices for us and for our nations and for our security and our protection. And not every society has the benefits that we have living here, where we have peace and justice, and we have security, which obviously could be improved, but in comparison to previous eras and to many other countries in the world, we're very blessed. And I think we need to be more thankful and more doing more to help men who have fallen on hard times. And I don't think there's a vacuum out there. There aren't the services, there aren't the supports, there isn't the knowledge, and more needs to be done.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned that if I wanted to go down the rabbit hole of purpose and meaning, just let you know. I want to keep that in mind, but first I want to keep going through your book a little bit more, because you
Sure.
also talk about substance abuse in males, and how it disproportionately seems to affect men. Why is that? What is going on there? Is it just the same factors, the stress, or is it biological?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of stigmas and stereotypes when people talk about substance abuse, and I'd like to talk about um, a typical journey that happens for people who end up abusing substances that is almost never talked about. So I mentioned earlier that there are many men who that there are certain domains of employment, which are certain industries which are dominated by men: military, police, manufacturing, transport. I mentioned there's a high rate of industrial accidents and industrial deaths in those fields, and 90% of industrial deaths are men, and I think over 80% of serious industrial accidents are men. What often happens is that there are men who are working in these fields who never dreamed of taking any drug, illegal or legal. They have a few beers, but they don't smoke. They certainly don't take cannabis. They don't take hard drugs, but they're exposed to they're involved in one of these industrial accidents, and it might not even be an acute accident over the course of time. If you're in the military, you're lifting up heavy things, you're going on exercise, you get chronic pain, chronic back pain, for example. Many of these men then go to their doctor, who will prescribe them opioids, which are kind of painkillers. And these are addictive painkillers. There's been many books on this subject. There's been lawsuits. The companies that made these painkillers knew about this and these addictive side effects, but didn't necessarily weren't as completely open as they could have been. So what happens then is that these men get addicted to these substances, and then they go back to their doctors and ask for more. And sometimes the doctors give them more, sometimes the doctors don't. And because they're addicted, then they end up going on the black market, or they end up getting hold of these drugs in other ways. And then they get into this spiral where they eventually turn out to be one of these statistics of someone who's addicted to opioids, or even someone who overdoses on opioids. And these are people, like I said, who are in the police, the military, who are anti-drugs, who were very much into health and fitness. And because of the wear and tear of their body, because they were involved in an accident, or because they were in the course of duty, received fire in the police or the military, and they end up as one of these 70, 80% of people. And nobody's talking about this, but it's a stereotype of, a young, I'm going to use like stigmatizing language, a young bum who doesn't want to work and lives in his mother's basement and is lazy. And the statistics don't necessarily show that. And this is again something that nobody's talking about. And in my book, I've got a whole chapter devoted to that, which I feel it's important to get
So,
out there.
so it sounds like it's not so much a mental health issue; it's more uh, circumstances led them there.
There are many people who are using substances who are using it for mental health issues. It's partly because one factor that I always talk about is pain. And
Mm.
when we use the word pain, a lot of people immediately default to physical pain, but there's also a thing called mental pain. Men who have gone through a messy divorce and then only allowed to see their children once a month for a weekend. Men who have, been a company man for decades and they were loyal to one company, and then suddenly they get, a letter saying, "Dear sir, we no longer need your services. Here's a tie and a calendar, and thank you for your 30 years."
Mhm.
And that can cause a huge amount of mental pain, and it can incur an existential vacuum. And like I said, we do know people who are more religious are less likely to kill themselves, also less likely to get engaged in substance use, because in a way that can kind of fill the vacuum and give them a meaning and purpose. But we do know that, for example, the statistics about religiosity show that there are fewer and fewer people going to a place of worship, engaging in acts of prayer, reading scripture, these kind of variables. But even if you take outside of religion, like trade union membership, Lions Club's membership, there's a book behind me called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, the
Mm-hmm.
Harvard sociologist. And he wrote that 20 years ago, saying we're on a course in society of people becoming much more atomized. And that proved to be true as the years rolled out. So we do really need to think about pain. We need to think about meaning. We need to think about purpose. We need to think about social integration. And pain, physical and mental pain, are often both highly interrelated.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, we're not necessarily just talking about older men as well, are we? When we talk about men's issues, we have to look at the youth as well. And in your book, you talk about ADHD and kind of the over medicating our youth. Can you speak to that more, please?
Yeah, so Christina Hoff Sommers, who is a great scholar, who I think she's at AEI or one of the think tanks in Washington. She wrote a great book about this, and I looked at some of the statistics, and I'm not going to pretend the thesis is mine. It really comes from her in a way, but we do know that ADHD rates have increased considerably. The diagnosis of ADHD, that the medication for ADHD has increased considerably. We know that in the US in particular, um, the rates of medication prescription and the rates of ADHD are much higher than in Europe, for example. And many people say, well, is this a true difference or is this an artifactual difference and it's due to something happening in psychiatry and pharmacology in the US? And there are some theories about this, but I think one that's really important is that the way the education system has changed, and also the way kind of parenting has changed, and even society has changed. That in decades previous, when I was a young whippersnapper, we were encouraged to go out and swim in lakes and to go and play in fields by our parents, and there were not moral panics about kidnapping and these kind of things. Some people have shown statistically at schools, for example, the lunch hour, the recesses, the time for sports, the time that's devoted to more practical topics like woodwork or metalwork
Mhm.
or these kind of things, physical exercise. But these have all contracted. And therefore, boys who, due to hormonal reasons, tend to have a lot of energy, don't have a chance in the education system to actually expand that energy. And because of moral panics and parenting and moral panics in communities, a lot of children who used to go out biking and swimming and climbing trees are now at home on their iPads looking at computer games, meaning that when they're at school, they are fidgeting, they're unhappy, they're restless, they've got all this energy, and that teachers and psychologists can just mistake this for a clinical diagnosis and illness, when in fact it's a natural state of being for many young boys who haven't had a chance to expand that energy. So my chapter really talks about that and brings together like the psychiatric statistics and the social science literature to argue that it's changes in education and specifically American education which have put boys in this situation and led to an overdiagnosis and over-medication.
Okay. And so it sounds like the school system itself is not designed for the typical boy, whatever the typical boy is. And that's led to the gender, or not the gender, the education gap, which you mentioned a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and the education gap is very important. Here in Canada, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is constantly talking about GILs and GILs deficits in education, and he's investing money in education in developing countries to help GILs, etc. But here in Canada, there's a huge issue in Quebec, in the province I live in. 1 in 3 young boys does not graduate high school on time. And some of them come back when they're 19, 20, 21 to get their high school diploma, where I think the rate for girls is 1 in 5. And it's not quite that stark elsewhere in Canada, but there's definitely a preponderance of boys who are dropping out of high school in the NEETs category. So it sounds dramatic, but there is some evidence to say the K-12 education system is failing boys. And why is it so that so many people who have a little bit of spare money available are sending their children to kind of private schools here in Canada, at least in Quebec? Everybody I know who has a bit of extra money wants to send their kid to a private school because there's more sports, there's more breaks, there's more extracurricular activities, there's more stuff for the boys to do, and it's really an issue which is going to affect the next generations because even if you're someone who doesn't care too much about men or boys, but you want to live in a society where there's peace and there's low rates of crime and there aren't huge amounts of disenchanted people, then you should be concerned about this issue because the last thing any of us want is to have feral young men around with no qualifications, no meaning, no purpose, because they're the kind of people who will join gangs, who will get involved in criminality, who will be not be contributing to the tax system or to society, but will instead be a burden on the tax system and society. So just out of enlightened self-interest, this is something we really need to address.
Not to mention the potential criminal effects it may have, the mental health issues they may be suffering from, the suicides that result from it. You know, it just sounds like the whole thing kind of just fits in one kind of system designed to, I don't want to say designed, but that looks like it's causing more issues than it's solving in the long run.
Yeah. And it is important to say, not to be over dramatic, that there are the majority of boys and young men are doing very well. You know, if I say 1 in 3 drop out, then 2 in 3 are getting their high school diploma and going on to work and to do things. So I don't have an apocalyptic vision of where we're going in society with these men and young men, but a high proportion of men are falling through the cracks and are starting on a journey in life which will not be very pleasant for them and might not be pleasant for people in their family and their neighborhoods and their cities. And it's just an unaddressed problem. And if we say we care about society and we pretend to, that is it a pretense or is it a reality? Because this is an area where we need much more solutions and more attention.
Certainly. Now, one of the main purposes of my show is to address the issue of male suicide and the causes of it. And you had mentioned that having a purpose, having a meaning in life is one of the factors that would weigh against them committing suicide. And you said there was a lot to discuss on that. So I'd like to open the floor and allow you to kind of go down that, if you will.
Yeah. So I like to look back in history slightly. And if you look, a generation or so back, again, young men, but even older middle-aged men where a lot of the suicides are concentrated, they were homeowners and they were putting money and effort into their house and their yard, and they were family men. They had their wife, they had their children, they had nephews and nieces. They were men of God. They went to churches, they went to synagogues, they participated in those places. They were community men. They volunteered for the local Little League coaches, the baseball team, the Rotary Club, in the Lions Club. Many men served in the military reserve, for example, I think the U.S. National Guard, you call it. Here in Canada, we have many reserve units. Men of a certain type would get involved in trade unions in their jobs or other workplace associations. And what we do know is that created a lot of meaning and purpose for people. They weren't just a robot who went to work and had dinner and went to sleep. They were enmeshed in all these social networks and all these communities. Obviously, there are times when people are tired and busy and they're not super involved in this kind of stuff. But for the average man, that was their life. Whereas now, a lot of those organizations have decreased in numbers. The membership of those organizations has also decreased in numbers. The younger generation coming through doesn't necessarily see anything attractive in that. Like I said, there's many young men who are more interested in video games, interested in whatever's happening on their phone, social media, the virtual world rather than the real world. And there's a lack of male role models, which is a huge factor, I think. So in the education system, there's very few elementary school teachers who are male. There are more elementary teachers there are more teachers in high school who are male, but still many more female teachers. The cadet units, these reserve units, are not as popular, where many men used to get their male role models. Due to high rates of divorce, many men are growing up in fatherless families, being raised by single mothers, where they don't have a positive male role model or influence, or at least not one who they're regularly exposed to. So I think all this combines what's happening at the level of the family, the level of education, the level of society, which puts men at this kind of, young men in particular, in this vacuum. And we know nature abhors a vacuum. If the good people in society, if young men are not being exposed to good men in society, then for sure they're going to go online and find bad men or get involved in gangs or criminal organizations, or simply just anesthetize the pain of life with drugs and alcohol.
So, thank you for sharing that. Now, you're focused on the psychiatric aspect of it, but many of the kind of recommendations you make there sound more political. How has it been on your end trying to kind of champion men's issues here, and are you being heard when you're trying to champion them?
Well, I always point to the evidence. Everything I say is evidence-based. So, some people could say, well, it supports a certain political orientation. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but everything I say is evidence-based, and there are people who don't like my message or feel it's, like you say, a certain political bent. But I'll just take the example of religion. And God, I've conducted many studies myself. I've read many other studies. And it's a fact, it's a clear fact with huge amounts of support that religiosity is positively associated with mental health. What that means is that the more religious you are, the less likely you are to have mental health problems, the less likely you are to have substance use issues, the less likely you are to have suicidal issues. And we know there are many factors. It's the individual relationship with God that is supportive. It's having a purpose and meaning beyond the self. It's being able to put any of your own suffering or setbacks into a narrative of God's evolving plan for you and the world. It's having access to the people in your congregation and to the ministers and the support workers who can help you in tough times, and then you help others in tough times. And this is just a fact. This is evidence-based. And I have said this message, and people say, oh, you're just you're promoting religion, and there's a lot of bad things in religion, and this, and the Catholic Church, people abuse kids or whatever. And of course, but we can talk about that, but we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the facts on one side do not negate facts on the others if they're not closely related. So when I put information out there are always people who are unhappy. But that's the nature. It's not specific to my field in psychiatry. That's the nature of psychiatry itself. If you work in psychiatry, in biological psychiatry, there are people in my hospital who do research on genetics, and they get attacked by sociologists who say mental illness is all about society and it's not about biology. And there are people in psychology who say that it's pharmaceuticals are the answer, and there are others who they get attacked because people say they're just whores for the drug companies and they're just taking the money from the drug companies and parroting whatever they tell them to do. So I'm not in a unique position. I certainly wouldn't see myself as any kind of victim. My role is to put the information out there, push it as much as I can, and if people act on it, that's great. And if they don't, then there's not much more I can do about it. Maybe I need to push harder.
Absolutely. Well, let me thank you for all your work. Like, these are issues that need to be researched, need to be discussed, and fact-based. Now, I don't want to take too much more of your time. We're coming up on half an hour. So do you have any final points or thoughts you want to share with us before we close out?
Just one thing which I didn't really talk about is the kind of solutions, and there are solutions. I'm a solutions-focused person, and one
Please.
place. So people typically think, well, the solutions to men's mental health issues are in the mental health system, in the psychiatric system, and they revolve around pharmaceuticals and around talking therapies and psychologists and psychiatrists. There's a growing amount of literature which I find very exciting, which is that it's civil society organizations that can play a huge role in helping men's mental health, and what Edmund Burke called the little platoons of society. So I'm sure your listeners would be interested in a Burkean explanation of mental illness. But the little platoons of society, I'm thinking about churches, about Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, reserve units, Little League baseball clubs. The more men who are involved in these organizations, young men, especially those who are kind of alienated or disenfranchised, if you can kind of reinsert them in these organizations, get them involved, give them leadership positions, we know that can be really helpful for men's mental health. There's an emerging literature on what's known as kind of bushcraft interventions or wilderness interventions, which is really exciting. I work with some here in Canada with veterans. And it basically takes men out into the wilderness, sometimes for 2 days, sometimes just a weekend, sometimes for a week. And they go somewhere where there's no cell phone signal, where they take some necessities, but they're expected to fish, sometimes even hunt. They cook their own food, they build their own fires. Some of them are led by military veterans who have these skills, and then they teach the younger guys how to do them. Aboriginal communities have been doing this for centuries, by the way, with their younger men. And this is really good for young men's mental health, to get them that sense in touch with nature, to learn new skills, to be exposed to good older men who can teach them things. And these are popping up all over North America, Canada, the US, and often on a shoestring budget. And people always say, well, where should we invest money? Where should we give money? And we need to have a discussion about this. But one of my proposals is, we throwing money into big hospitals and into psychologists, psychiatrists is a bit like a leaky bucket. You can put 50 million into this hospital I work at, and it would just help the facade of the granite, which is crumbling. But if you give 50 million to these community organizations on the ground, in the trenches, helping young men, that could have a great effect. And I really, personally, I'm trying to support these civil society organizations. I do some work with them. And these grassroots organizations, I think, are the future of men's mental health, and that's where we should be targeting our attention.
Perfect. All right. Dr. Whitley, thank you so much for coming on. If someone wanted to reach out to you, how can they get in touch with you?
Best thing is to drop me an email, robert.whitley@mcgill.ca. And I get lots of emails every day, but if I have time, I'll certainly be happy to engage with people, and especially if it's about some of my passions, which came out in this interview, I think.
Absolutely. No, I really enjoyed this interview. Thank you so much, Dr. Whitley. This was a blast. I try to make my show very fact-based if I can. There is a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of kind of feeling involved in this, and to be able to point to data, for me, it makes it clear, because I used to be an attorney, and for me, it's all about the facts, right?
Right.
So thank you so much. We genuinely appreciate you coming on, taking the time with us today.
Well, thank you. You've done a lot for a young man. You've got a PhD, and you used to be an attorney. And
JD, actually.
A JD is it? Oh, well, okay,
Yeah.
cool. Well, that's great.
Thank you.
Okay.
So let me sign out, and I'm going to remind everybody, keep looking for the light in the tempest. God will show you the way.